It started like any other night on the graveyard shift. The silence of the office was only broken by the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of the building settling. It was just past midnight when Alex leaned back in his chair, half bored, half exhausted. With most of his work done and nothing but darkness outside the tall windows, he reached over to the old desk radio sitting beside the outdated computer monitor. It was a habit he'd formed during the long, lonely hours, scanning through stations to fill the silence with static or soft late-night talk shows. That night, though, something felt off the moment he touched the dial. There was a strange resistance, almost like the radio didn't want to turn. When he finally got it to move, instead of picking up a regular station, he found himself stuck on a quiet, buzzing frequency, 103.6 FM, a frequency he didn't remember ever tuning into before. The static wasn't the usual kind either. It had an odd rhythm, a pulsing that almost sounded like a faint heartbeat hidden deep beneath the noise. Curious and a little unnerved, Alex leaned closer, his fingers hovering over the volume knob. Then, suddenly, the static cleared for a moment, just a breath, just long enough to make him freeze. A single word echoed out of the speaker, soft and distorted, like it had traveled a long way to get there. It said his name, Alex. He stared at the radio. At first, he thought it was a coincidence, maybe part of some late-night audio art or radio theatre piece. But then it repeated, clearer this time, slower, more deliberate. Alex. The voice was neither male nor female. It had a strange, emotionless quality to it. No background music, no signal marker, just the voice, like someone whispering from the other end of a tunnel. Goosebumps rose on his arms. He scanned the frequency, again, moving the dial slightly forward and backward. Nothing, just static. But the moment he turned it back to 103.6, the voice returned. Not just calling his name anymore. It said things, fragments, phrases that made no sense, but hit him with unsettling familiarity. You left the window open. It's coming, in now. And do you remember the blue bicycle? Things no one should know, things he hadn't thought about in years. He checked the building. He was alone, just as he'd always been on this shift. He picked up his phone and searched online for any mention of a broadcast on 103.6 FM. There were no results. Not locally, not regionally, not even obscure ham radio threads mentioned it. It didn't exist, but it was there, in the room with him, whispering things that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Alex thought about turning it off. He reached for the dial again, but something inside him hesitated. It wasn't just fear. It was curiosity. A deep, almost magnetic pull to listen further. He told himself it was just some elaborate prank, some hidden broadcast meant to scare or entertain, maybe even some experimental art piece. That would be easier to believe. That would make sense. But nothing about it felt like a performance. The voice changed again. No longer just a whisper, it began to speak in a slow, rhythmic tone, like reading a script or a warning. Still, no music, no distortion, just a calm clarity that filled the room like a cold wind. The signal is open now. Do not answer back. Do not speak. Alex leaned in, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the radio. The screen on the front, usually blank, flickered faintly, as though responding to the voice. A pattern of faint blue. Lines danced across the display. They moved like a heartbeat, or maybe like a signal trying to take shape. The first night it happened, Alex tried to convince himself it was a fluke. Maybe his mind playing tricks on him after too many sleepless shifts. But the following night, at exactly 12:03 a.m., he turned the dial again, and the frequency was still there. 103.6 FM. Static buzzed softly, layered with that same eerie pulsing sound that had haunted his thoughts all day. He stared at the radio for a long moment before he dared to touch it, the air in the room heavy like a storm was about to break. This time, he didn't need to wait long. As soon as he turned the volume up, the voice returned. It spoke with more clarity, cutting through the static like a knife. "You're listening again, Alex," it said. "You shouldn't have come back." The voice wasn't just addressing someone named Alex, it was addressing him. There was no ambiguity, no randomness. It knew he was there, listening. It was aware. Alex's breath caught in his throat. He stared at the radio like it was alive. The room, once dim and quiet, suddenly felt smaller. He looked over his shoulder instinctively, even though he was still completely alone. The voice didn't stop. "You think this is a game, but this is a signal meant only for those who hear." He grabbed his phone again, recording a short clip this time, just to prove to himself that it was real. But when he played it back, there was only white noise. No voice, no words, nothing but the crackling emptiness of static. He checked the time. 12:08 a.m., the same hour, the same voice. It continued speaking like it was having a one-way conversation with him. It didn't ask questions. It delivered statements, things that were impossible for anyone else to know. You dreamed about the water again, the black lake, the hand reaching from beneath. You locked the drawer, but the photograph is still missing. You're starting to remember, aren't you? Alex stood up from his chair, pacing the room with a growing unease. The voice was no longer just eerie, it was invasive, like it had crawled inside his mind. Every sentence felt targeted, precise, not general, not vague. It brought up memories he hadn't accessed in years. Some of them weren't even fully formed, just fragments of childhood, glimpses of shadows in places he no longer remembered, clearly. A hospital corridor, a red hallway, a woman crying behind a door. He returned to the desk, staring at the radio like it might explain itself. The light on the dial flickered dimly, casting strange shadows on the wall. Then, for the first time, the voice paused. Silence hung for a few seconds. Then it said something different, something terrifying. "Would you like to ask me something, Alex?" He froze. It wasn't just speaking to him now. It was waiting, expecting a response. He had the sensation of being watched. Though there were no cameras, no windows facing the street, the stillness of the room turned oppressive. The shadows stretched longer than they should have. The voice wasn't just a recording or a transmission. It was interactive. It responded. It listened. He stared at the microphone built into the radio, something he had never used, never even thought about before. It was a relic of a time when the device was more than just for receiving. When people could send signals too. He leaned forward slightly, unsure if he should speak. The idea of talking back made his skin crawl. But the longer he waited, the more insistent the atmosphere became. The air felt thicker, like pressure was building in the walls. The voice came, again, softer this time, closer somehow, as if it was right behind his ear, instead of in the speaker. "Say something. We're listening." Alex didn't remember telling anyone about the bicycle. It was blue with a rusted chain and torn leather on the seat, something he'd left behind in his grandparents' garage decades ago. He hadn't thought about it in years, but the voice, on the radio, brought it up like it was common knowledge. "The blue bicycle you hid behind the shed," it said calmly, as if describing the weather. He froze, mouth dry, hands trembling near the volume knob. There was no way anyone could know that. Not unless they had been there. Not unless they had seen it too. It wasn't just the bicycle. Night after night, the radio seemed to dig deeper. Each broadcast after midnight peeled back another layer of Alex's life, exposing memories so personal, so specific, they barely existed outside his own thoughts. "You still have the drawing you made when the fire alarm went off in 3rd grade, it whispered one night. "The one with the black crayon. You called it the screaming tree." The words hit him with a weight he couldn't explain. He had that drawing folded inside a shoebox buried in the back of his closet. He hadn't looked at it since he was a child. Another night, The voice recited part of a letter he wrote but never sent. A note he had torn up and flushed down the toilet years ago after a falling out with his father. The voice spoke it word for word, down to the last sentence. The tone was always the same. Calm, patient, void of emotion, like it was reading from a long list of index files that only he should have access to. But the more it revealed, the more it began to feel like the radio wasn't just accessing memories. It was studying him. He started to feel watched not just during the broadcasts, but during the day as well. Paranoia crept into his routine. He unplugged the radio and locked it away in the supply cabinet once, thinking he could stop whatever was happening. But when midnight came, the frequency returned, this time playing through the speakers of the office computer, even though no media was running. The voice greeted him again. "You tried to hide it. That's understandable." Sleep became impossible. The anxiety of what the radio would say next weighed on him like a 1,000-pound stone. He began writing down the things it said, trying to find patterns, some logic that could explain why these particular memories were being brought up. But they weren't in any order. They weren't themed. They were just his, raw, untouched moments from a life no one else could possibly know so intimately. It began to feel like someone, or something, had peeled open his mind like a book. Sometimes the voice would mention events he barely remembered until it said them out loud. "You stepped on the glass behind the gas station when you were 9. You told your mother it was a nail." He blinked at the memory. The blood, the lie, the bandage. All of it came rushing back like a flood. But why bring that up? Why now? The questions started to spiral. Who was on the other side of the signal? What were they gaining by doing this? Was it artificial? Some AI programmed to gather information? Or something much older? Something that had found a way to reach across barriers no one understood? The voice never answered questions. It only delivered truths. And as the nights wore on, the truths grew darker, more painful, until Alex began to dread each passing hour. Watching the clock like a prisoner watching his cell door, he stopped confiding in friends. They wouldn't believe him anyway. Who would? A haunted radio that knows your thoughts sounds like the beginning of madness, not a real threat. But Alex knew better now. It wasn't just a radio anymore. It was a mirror with a voice, reflecting things no one else could see. It was on the 4th night that Alex first heard the other voices. The usual presence, calm, measured, hauntingly familiar, had just finished another unnerving statement about something he'd forgotten doing in college, something no one else had ever known. But then the static shifted, like the frequency had been hijacked. A crackling surge broke through the steady hum, followed by what sounded like heavy breathing. Then a new voice came through. This one was different, urgent, scared, whispering fast like time was running out. "Don't answer it," the voice said, shaky and human, full of emotion. "Don't talk back. It hears you when you think." The tone was nothing like the main voice that usually spoke to Alex. This one sounded terrified, as though it was broadcasting from some cold, forgotten corner of the world. There was panic in every syllable, and something in the background, banging maybe. A door being pounded on, a distant scream, then silence again. Alex stared at the radio, stunned. The usual voice returned, as if nothing had happened, resuming its cryptic monologue about his childhood fears and forgotten nightmares. But now Alex knew he wasn't the only one hearing the signal. Someone else, somewhere, had found it too, and that person had tried to warn him. The next night, he sat at the desk with a notepad, ready. The moment the static began, he held his breath. The familiar voice spoke first, reciting his high school locker combination. But then, just a few minutes in, it cut out again. Another voice broke through. This time, it was a woman. Her voice was hoarse, desperate, and the signal was weaker. "Please listen to me," she said. "You think it's just talking to you, but it's learning. Every time you listen, it learns more. It knows how to mimic, how to become someone you trust." She sounded like she was crying. It used my brother's voice. I answered. I shouldn't have answered. Then the transmission dropped, like someone had pulled the plug. The regular voice returned seconds later, calm and undisturbed, as though it hadn't noticed the interruption. She remembers the snow, it said softly. She buried the photo in the garden behind the red fence, the one they painted after the fire. Alex felt a chill crawl up his spine. It was now speaking about her. Whoever she was, this woman who had broken through, the voice on the radio knew her too. And now, so did he. Over the next few days, the pattern continued. Always past midnight. Always after the static. More voices came, fragmented and weak, like ghostly messages sent from a sinking ship. Some were sobbing. Some were shouting. A few were distorted beyond comprehension. But he could still feel the panic beneath, the noise. Most of them said the same thing in different ways. Don't talk back. Don't let it in. Don't believe its promises. One voice, broken and rasping, repeated a phrase over and over before being cut off. It's not a frequency, it's a doorway. That sentence looped in Alex's mind for hours. He tried not to think about what it meant, but the implications were impossible to ignore. More than once, he heard someone call his name again, but it wasn't the same voice. It was his mother's voice. She had been gone for 5 years. Then his brother's voice. His brother, who lived on the other side of the country and never called. The radio didn't just know things, it recreated them. Perfectly. Down to the cadence, the tone, the tiny speech quirks only someone close would recognize. Alex started recording everything, but each morning when he reviewed the files, they were blank. Just silence or static. No voices, no warnings. It was like the radio erased itself the moment daylight arrived, like it didn't want to be remembered. Reality began to feel thinner with each night Alex tuned in. At first, it was just the odd timing of the broadcasts, the inexplicable knowledge the voice had about his past. But now, the world around him was beginning to shift in ways he couldn't explain. Familiar spaces felt wrong. The office hallway seemed longer one night, as if it had stretched while he wasn't looking. Lights flickered more often. Shadows moved even when nothing else did. Everything felt off by just a few degrees. Not enough to scream for help, but enough to gnaw at the edges of his sanity. When he looked at the clock, time didn't move the way it should. He'd glance at it once, and it would say 12:11. Then, what felt like only a moment later, it would still read 12:11. Or worse, 12:10. His reflection in the window no longer moved in perfect sync with him. One night, as he turned away, he swore he saw his reflection blink half a second too late. The first time it happened, he told himself it was exhaustion. The second time, he didn't sleep at all. The voice on the radio began to change too. It still spoke in that calm, measured way, but the content started to warp. It no longer simply recalled facts from his past. Now, it described things that hadn't happened yet. You'll spill coffee on your shirt at 2:14 p.m. tomorrow, it said. You'll get a phone call from someone pretending to be your bank. At first, Alex dismissed them as nonsense. But then the events happened exactly as described, down to the smallest detail. A drop of coffee on the collar. A scam call asking for his social security number. The predictions were never dramatic, just precise, specific, undeniably real. Worse still were the predictions about things he couldn't verify right away. A dog you've never met will die at 4:33 a.m., the voice once said. She will cry, but you won't know why until you remember. Sentences that made no sense in the moment, but clung to him like burrs, stuck in his mind, waiting to bloom into meaning later. As the broadcasts became more intense, Alex noticed strange gaps in his memory. He would find himself standing in the kitchen at home with the stove on, having no recollection of walking there. He started finding notes in his handwriting, short, cryptic phrases like, "Don't believe what you see at 3 a.m. or "It's already inside the building." He had no memory of writing them. Some were scribbled in notebooks, others on the backs of receipts. Once, one was written directly on his bathroom mirror in red dry erase marker. He lived alone. The walls of the office seemed to press in closer with each night. He stopped feeling safe indoors, but outdoors wasn't much better. Streetlights flickered when he passed beneath them. Dogs barked at him from across the street. Once, while walking to his car after work, he saw a figure across the parking lot, tall, motionless, standing just at the edge of the light. When he blinked, it was gone. The camera on his phone refused to work between midnight and 1 a.m. Every photo came out black. Every video was corrupted. He kept trying to tell himself it wasn't real, that the world wasn't changing. That he was. Maybe the stress had finally caught up with him. Maybe he'd slipped into some kind of waking dream. But no matter how many times he unplugged the radio, removed the batteries, locked it in a drawer, the signal still found a way through. It played through the TV speakers once, through the Bluetooth on his phone another time. It didn't need the radio anymore. It only needed midnight. The voice never raised its volume. It didn't need to scream to be heard. It just kept whispering truths, some too personal to deny, others too strange to comprehend. And through it all, the line between memory and imagination began to blur. On the sixth night, something finally changed in the tone of the voice. It was subtle at first, just a shift in cadence, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to mimic how Alex was breathing. It spoke as it always did, with confidence and unnatural precision. But now there was something else buried beneath its calm delivery. A sense of closeness, not just proximity through the radio, but something deeper, as if it was speaking from within his own thoughts, rather than through a speaker. The room was silent except for the static and the voice, but Alex felt surrounded. He began to notice details he hadn't before. The radio no longer showed the station frequency. The digital screen glitched slightly, blinking numbers that didn't make sense, symbols instead of digits, odd runes that flickered and then vanished. It was no longer operating like any normal device. It had evolved or adapted, becoming something more than just a tool of transmission. That night, the voice didn't just recall events or deliver cryptic warnings. It told a story about a man who lived alone, who tuned into a forgotten frequency each night, thinking he was in control, thinking he was just curious. The story followed that man as he listened longer and longer, until he began to change, until the voice started mimicking him perfectly, and eventually replacing him. The words were chilling not because they were dramatic, but because they felt rehearsed, inevitable. As the story went on, Alex realized it was describing him with exact detail, every moment aligned with his experience. And then it said something new. "Do you know how many have listened before you?" it asked. "How many thought they were the first? You are not special, Alex. You are simply next." Alex's body tensed. It wasn't just watching him anymore. It was letting him know that this was a cycle, a pattern repeated countless times. Others had tuned in, had listened, had fallen into the same spiral. What had happened to them? Were they now voices in the static, the terrified ones he occasionally heard breaking through the signal? Had they all once thought they could resist, only to be consumed piece by piece? The voice began to speak faster now, as though time was running out. It repeated phrases he had heard before, but now they were stacked on top of each other, layered and distorted. Some were in his own voice. That was the moment he realized what it had been doing all along, copying him. Every word he had ever spoken aloud in its presence, every reaction, every breath. It had recorded and memorized them. Now it was using them, talking back in his tone, repeating personal thoughts that he hadn't even voiced. It was forming a version of him. At exactly 12:44 a.m., the room went silent. Not just quiet, silent. No humming from the ceiling light, no ticking from the wall clock, no outside traffic. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, like the world had paused. Then, the voice spoke again, but not through the radio this time. It came from somewhere else, everywhere at once. The walls, the floor, the air around him. And it wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling, a vibration that trembled through his bones. "You've listened long enough," it said. "Now it's your turn." Alex stood up too fast, knocking over the chair. The lights dimmed around him. His computer monitor turned on by itself, showing a reflection that wasn't quite his. The figure on the screen smiled before he did. The hands moved out of sync. The reflection blinked too slowly. He backed away, but every screen he passed, his phone, the tablet on the counter, even the powered-off TV, showed the same reflection, the same wrong version of himself, now fully formed and watching him closely. Each one whispered a different version of the same phrase in unison.